Hey guys, welcome back to another sleepy journey through history's most overlooked chapters. Tonight, we're settling in for something specialer, deep dive into civilizations that somehow managed to rule vast territories, build incredible cities, and last for centuries, all while completely escaping the attention of your high school history teacher. So grab your coziest blanket, dim those lights, and let's drift through time together. We're talking about empires that didn't get the Hollywood treatment, kingdoms that never made it onto the standardized tests, and cultures that were too busy being successful to worry about their PR campaigns. These are the civilizations that just sort of existed brilliantly for hundreds of years, then quietly faded away like that friend who moves to another city and you realize 6 months later you haven't heard from them. Tonight's tour takes us everywhere from the mountains of Peru to the trading ports of Southeast Asia, from forgotten African kingdoms to medieval European principalities that probably had better healthcare systems than some modern countries. We'll meet rulers with names you can't pronounce, visit cities that were more advanced than anything Europe had to offer, and discover that most of human history is way more interesting and way less violent than the dramatic stuff that made it into the textbooks. Let's start our journey in ancient Peru with a civilization that figured out how to build a thriving society in one of the world's most challenging environments. Meet the Mocha, who existed from about 100 to 700 CE along Peru's northern coast, in a region that receives less rainfall than some parts of Mars. Mocha looked at the Atacama Desert and said, "You know what this needs? Massive irrigation systems and pyramid complexes." And somehow they made it work. They built elaborate canal systems that brought water from the Andes Mountains down to the coast, turning barren desert into fertile agricultural land. It was like ancient terraforming, except with more llamas and fewer spacesuits. Their capital region, around modern-day Trujillo, became home to some of the most impressive structures in pre-Columbian America. The Huaca del Sol, or Temple of the Sun, required an estimated 130 million adobe bricks to construct. That's the kind of project that would give modern construction managers anxiety attacks. But the Mocha just got on with it, one brick at a time, for several generations. But here's what makes the Mocha perfect for our sleepy tours. They weren't conquerors in the traditional sense. They didn't build their civilization through dramatic military campaigns or heroic battles. They built it through engineering, agriculture, and what appears to have been a remarkably sophisticated understanding of desert ecology. The Mocha developed some of the most advanced metallurgy in the ancient Americas. They worked with gold, silver, copper, and various alloys, creating intricate jewelry and ceremonial objects that rival anything produced in the Old World, their sea. They also left behind some of the most detailed ceramic art in the ancient world. Mocha pottery depicts everything from daily life to religious ceremonies, from portraits of individual rulers to explicit scenes that would make a Victorian anthropologist blush. It's like having a photo album of ancient Peruvian life, except the photos are ceramic vessels that have survived for 1,500 years. The Mocha practiced human sacrifice, which sounds dramatic until you realize it was probably less traumatic than rush hour traffic in most modern cities. Their sacrificial ceremonies appear to have been highly ritualized affairs, often connected 2 agricultural cycles, and the need to ensure continued water flow from the mountains. But what really sets the Mocha apart is how they dealt with environmental challenges. Around 600 CE, they faced a series of severe droughts and El Niño events that devastated their agricultural systems. Instead of collapsing immediately, they adapted. They modified their irrigation systems, changed their crop selection, and even relocated some of their major settlements. The Mocha civilization gradually transformed into what archaeologists call the Chima culture, which lasted until the Inca conquest in the 15th century. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, it was more like a very slow corporate restructuring that took place over several generations. For 6 centuries, the Mocha built and maintained one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, in an environment that would challenge modern engineers. They left behind impressive monuments, incredible art, and proof that humans can thrive almost anywhere if they're willing to be creative about water management. Now, let's drift back even further in time to meet what might have been America's first major civilization. The Olmec existed from roughly 1400 to 400 BCE in what's now southern Mexico. And they're one of those civilizations that archaeologists get really excited about, while everyone else yawns and asks when we're getting to the Aztecs. The Olmec are famous for their massive stone heads. 17 of them have been found so far, each weighing between 6 and 50 tons, and carved from basalt, quarried up to 100 kilometers away. Moving these heads would be challenging even today, but somehow the Olmec managed it, using only human labor, ingenuity, and probably a lot of complaining about overtime. But the stone heads are just the most visible remnant of what was, apparently, a quite sophisticated civilization. The Olmec built the first major ceremonial centers in Mesoamerica, developed early forms of writing and mathematics, and created a calendar system that influenced later Mesoamerican cultures. They also appear to have been the first civilization in the Americas to develop a complex religious system centered around jaguar imagery. This makes sense if you've ever encountered a jaguar in the wild, which is an experience that would certainly inspire religious feelings, mostly of the please don't eat me variety. The Olmec civilization is mysterious in that perfectly sleepy way we love. They had no dramatic wars that we know of, no heroic rulers whose names have come down to us, no apocalyptic ending. They just developed the foundational elements of Mesoamerican civilization and then gradually faded away, leaving their massive stone heads staring enigmatically across the jungle. What makes the Olmec particularly interesting is their apparent influence on later civilizations. Elements of Olmec art, architecture, and religious symbolism show up in Maya, Zapotec, and other Mesoamerican cultures. They were like the ancient world's cultural incubator, developing ideas that would influence the region for millennia. The Olmec civilization is mysterious in that perfectly sleepy way we love. They had no dramatic wars that we know of, no heroic rulers whose names have come down to us, no apocalyptic ending. Civilization and then gradually faded away, leaving their massive stone heads staring enigmatically across the jungle. What makes the Olmec particularly interesting is their apparent influence on later civilizations. Elements of Olmec art, architecture, and religious symbolism show up in Maya, Zapotec, and other Mesoamerican cultures. They were like the ancient world's cultural incubator, developing ideas that would influence the region for millennia. Let's float over to the Middle East now to meet one of history's most successful trading civilizations. The Nabateans controlled much of the Arabian Peninsula and the southern Levant from roughly the 4th century BCE to 106 CE, and they're probably best known today for the treasury building in Petra that shows up in every list of most beautiful archaeological sites. But Petra was just one city in a vast trading network that stretched from southern Arabia to Damascus. The Nabateans were the FedEx of the ancient world, controlling the incense and spice trade routes that connected Asia with the Mediterranean. If you wanted frankincense, myrrh, silk, or spices in the Roman Empire, you probably dealt with Nabatean merchants at some point. The Nabateans were Arabs who adopted Hellenistic culture when it suited their business interests, which shows a refreshing pragmatism about cultural identity. They spoke Arabic, but wrote in Aramaic, worshipped Arab gods alongside Greek ones, and built cities that combined Arab, Greek, and Roman architectural elements. They were cultural synthesis experts, centuries before anyone invented that term. What makes the Nabateans perfect for our sleepy tours is their remarkable skill at desert survival. They developed some of the most sophisticated water management systems in the ancient world, carving cisterns, channels, and dams out of solid rock to capture and store every drop of precious rainfall. Their capital at Petra wasn't just a pretty facade carved into pink sandstone. It was an engineering marvel. The entire city was designed around water collection and storage, with elaborate systems to capture rainwater and channel it to underground cisterns. They basically turned a desert valley into a sustainable urban center, which is more than most modern cities can claim. The Nabateans also mastered the art of being useful to everyone while threatening no one. They provided essential services to the Roman Empire without directly challenging Roman authority. They were like the Switzerland of the ancient Middle East, except with more camel caravans and fewer banks. Their downfall came when the Romans decided they wanted direct control of the lucrative trade routes. In 106 CE, Emperor Trajan simply annexed the Nabatean kingdom and turned it into the Roman province of Arabia. It wasn't particularly dramatic, more like a corporate takeover than a military conquest. But even after the Roman annexation, Nabatean culture and trade networks continued for several more centuries. The people didn't disappear. They just became Roman subjects who happened to be really good at desert commerce for over 4 centuries. The Nabateans controlled some of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. They built incredible cities, mastered desert engineering, and accumulated vast wealth through peaceful commerce. Today, most people know Petra from movies, but have never heard the name Nabataean. Now, let's take a gentle journey to West Africa to meet one of the continent's most influential early civilizations. The Noack culture existed from around 1500 BCE to 300 CE in what's now central Nigeria, and they were among the first people south of the Sahara to master ironworking, which was kind of a big deal in the technological development of Africa. The Noack are famous today mainly for their distinctive terracotta sculptures, elegant, stylized figures with elaborate hairstyles and jewelry that look remarkably modern despite being over 2,000 years old. These sculptures are scattered across museum collections around the world, often with minimal context about the civilization that created them. But the Noac were much more than talented sculptors. They developed sophisticated ironworking techniques that spread across West Africa, fundamentally changing agriculture, warfare, and daily life throughout the region. Iron tools made farming more efficient, which supported larger populations and more complex societies. The Noac also appear to have been skilled farmers who developed sustainable agricultural practices adapted to West Africa's challenging climate. They grew millet, sorghum, and other crops that could withstand periods of drought, and they domesticated African yams, which became a staple food throughout the region. What makes the Noac perfect for our theme is how little we actually know about their political organization or social structure. They didn't leave behind massive monuments or written records. They just quietly developed the technologies and artistic traditions that would influence West African cultures for millennia. The Noac culture gradually evolved into later civilizations, like the Kingdom of Ife and eventually the Yoruba city-states. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, more like a slow cultural evolution that took place over many generations. Archaeological evidence suggests the Noac lived in small settlements scattered across the Nigerian plateau, connected by trade networks and shared cultural practices. They were probably organized into kinship groups rather than centralized states, which made them resilient but historically invisible. For nearly 2 millennia, the Noac developed and refined technologies that would shape African history. They created art that still influences African artists today. And they laid the foundation for the ironworking traditions that gave later African/kingdoms their technological edge. Today, the Noac culture is known mainly to specialists in African history and art collectors who pay enormous sums for Noac sculptures on the international art market. But their influence on African civilization was profound and lasting, even if their name has been largely forgotten. Let's drift back to South America to meet one of the most mysterious civilizations of the pre-Columbian Andes, the Chachapoya, also known as the Warriors of the Clouds, existed from around 900 to 1470 CE in the cloud forests of northern Peru, in a region so remote and inaccessible that Spanish conquistadors barely bothered with it. The Chachapoya built their civilization in one of the most challenging environments imaginable: steep mountainsides, covered in perpetual cloud forest, at altitudes of 2,000 to 3,000 meters. It's the kind of terrain that modern hikers consider extremely challenging. But somehow, the Chachapoya managed to build extensive urban settlements, agricultural terraces, and defensive fortifications across this vertical landscape. Their most famous site, Kulap, is sometimes called the Machu Picchu of the north, though it's actually much larger and arguably more impressive than the more famous Inca site. Kulap contains over 400 structures enclosed by massive stone walls, built on a mountain ridge that offers commanding views of the surrounding valleys. But here's what makes the Chachapoya particularly interesting for our sleepy tour. They were apparently quite successful at resisting both Inca and Spanish conquest. The Incas managed to subdue them eventually, but it took decades of warfare and negotiation. The Spanish found them so difficult to conquer that they largely left them alone until the 17th century. The Chachapoya developed unique architectural techniques adapted to their mountainous environment. Their buildings used round stone, foundations unusual in the Andes sand, They decorated their structures with intricate friezes showing geometric patterns, animals, and human figures. They also practiced mummification and built elaborate cliffside tombs called cholpas, some of which are so inaccessible that archaeologists need mountaineering equipment to reach them. The Chachapoya apparently believed that the more difficult it was to reach your tomb, the better your afterlife would be. The Chachapoya were skilled weavers, producing textiles that were prized throughout the Andes. They also developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, building extensive terrace systems that allowed them to grow crops on nearly vertical mountainsides. Their civilization came to an end gradually during the colonial period as Spanish diseases decimated the population, and colonial administration forced the survivors to relocate to more accessible areas. By the 18th century, the cloud cities were largely abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. For over 5 centuries, the Chachapoya maintained a sophisticated civilization in one of the world's most challenging environments. They built impressive cities, resisted multiple conquests, and developed unique cultural traditions adapted to life in the clouds today. The Chachapoya region is slowly being opened to tourism, but it remains one of Peru's most remote and least visited archaeological zones. The cloud warriors have largely returned to the clouds, remembered mainly by archaeologists and the few tourists brave enough to attempt the challenging journey to their mountaintop cities. Let's float over to Central Africa now to visit the shores of Lake Chad and meet one of Africa's most successful but forgotten empires. The Kanem Empire existed from around 700 to 1380 CE, controlling trade routes across the Sahara and building one of medieval East Africa's most sophisticated political systems. The Kanem Empire was centered around Lake Chad, which in medieval times was much larger than it is today, roughly the size of the Caspian Sea. This gave the empire control over both the lake's fishing and agricultural resources and the trans-Saharan trade routes that connected north and west. Africa. The empire was founded by the Kanuri people, who developed a complex system of government that balanced traditional African political structures with Islamic administrative practices. The Mays, or kings, of Kanem converted to Islam around 1085 CE, making Kanem one of the first major Islamic states in sub-Saharan Africa. But the original Kanem Empire, centered around Lake Chad, had lasted for nearly 7 centuries. They controlled vast territories, accumulated impressive wealth through trade, and developed sophisticated political and religious institutions. Today, the Lake Chad region is divided among several modern countries: Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon. The lake itself has shrunk dramatically due to climate change and overuse. The Kanem Empire is remembered mainly by specialists in African history, despite being one of medieval Africa's most successful political entities. Now let's drift over to Southeast Asia to meet one of the region's first major political entities. The Funan Empire existed from roughly the 1st to 6th centuries CE in what's now southern Vietnam and Cambodia, and they were probably the first Southeast Asian civilization to develop the political and economic structures that would characterize the region for centuries. Funan emerged in the Mekong Delta, one of the world's great river systems, where the kingdom controlled both the agricultural wealth of the delta and the maritime trade routes that connected China with India. They were strategically positioned to become the middlemen of Asian commerce, which made them wealthy and politically important. The kingdom was heavily influenced by Indian culture, adopting Hinduism and Sanskrit writing while maintaining their own Southeast Asian identity. This cultural synthesis became the model for later Southeast Asian kingdoms adopt useful foreign flunks technologies and ideas while maintaining local traditions. Chinese records describe Funan as a sophisticated kingdom with impressive cities, elaborate irrigation systems, and a complex administrative structure. The Chinese were generally not impressed by foreign civilizations, so the fact that they spoke positively about Funan suggests it was genuinely impressive. Funan's capital, GCEO, was a major port city that attracted merchants from throughout Asia. Archaeological excavations have found Roman coins, Indian jewelry, and Chinese ceramics, proving that Funan was connected to global trade networks that stretched from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. The kingdom also developed sophisticated hydraulic engineering, building canals and reservoirs that managed the annual flooding of the Mekong Delta. This allowed them to support large populations and surplus agricultural production that could support non-farming specialists. But here's what makes Funan perfect for our theme. They were successful through adaptation rather than conquest. They didn't build their empire through dramatic military campaigns. They built it by positioning themselves strategically in trade networks and adapting foreign ideas to local conditions. Funan's decline was gradual as political power shifted inland to the Khmer kingdoms that would eventually build Angkor. The coastal trade routes that had made Funan wealthy were disrupted by political changes in China and India, and new powers emerged in the Mekong region by the 6th century. Funan had been largely absorbed by its former vassals, particularly the Khmer Kingdom of Chenla. The delta returned to smaller political units, and the great port cities were gradually abandoned for 5 centuries. Funan was one of Southeast Asia's major political and economic powers. They established the political and cultural patterns that would influence the region for over a millennium, and they proved that Southeast Asian civilizations could be major players in global trade networks. Today, Funan is known mainly to specialists in Southeast Asian history, and most of the ancient sites are buried under centuries of river silt or modern development. Now let's drift over to Southeast Asia to meet one of the region's first major political entities. The Funan Empire existed from roughly the 1st to 6th centuries CE in what's now southern Vietnam and Cambodia, and they were probably the first Southeast Asian civilization to develop the political and economic structures that would characterize the region for centuries. Funan emerged in the Mekong Delta, one of the world's great river systems, where the kingdom controlled both the agricultural wealth of the delta and the maritime trade routes that connected China with India. They were strategically positioned to become the middlemen of Asian commerce, which made them wealthy and politically important. The kingdom was heavily influenced by Indian culture, adopting Hinduism and Sanskrit writing while maintaining their own Southeast Asian identity. This cultural synthesis became the model for later Southeast Asian kingdoms adopt useful foreign flunks technologies and ideas while maintaining local traditions. Chinese records describe Funan as a sophisticated kingdom with impressive cities, elaborate irrigation systems, and a complex administrative structure. The Chinese were generally not impressed by foreign civilizations, so the fact that they spoke positively about Funan suggests it was genuinely impressive. Funan's capital, GCEO, was a major port city that attracted merchants from throughout Asia. Archaeological excavations have found Roman coins, Indian jewelry, and Chinese ceramics, proving that Funan was connected to global trade networks that stretched from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. The kingdom also developed sophisticated hydraulic engineering, building canals and reservoirs that managed the annual flooding of the Mekong Delta. This allowed them to support large populations and surplus agricultural production that could support non-farming specialists. But here's what makes Funan perfect for our theme. They were successful through adaptation rather than conquest. They didn't build their empire through dramatic military campaigns. They built it by positioning themselves strategically in trade networks and adapting foreign ideas to local conditions. Funan's decline was gradual as political power shifted inland to the Khmer kingdoms that would eventually build Angkor. The coastal trade routes that had made Funan wealthy were disrupted by political changes in China and India, and new powers emerged in the Mekong region by the 6th century. Funan had been largely absorbed by its former vassals, particularly the Khmer Kingdom of Chenla. The delta returned to smaller political units, and the great port cities were gradually abandoned for 5 centuries. Funan was one of Southeast Asia's major political and economic powers. They established the political and cultural patterns that would influence the region for over a millennium, and they proved that Southeast Asian civilizations could be major players in global trade networks. Today, Funan is known mainly to specialists. In Southeast Asian history, the Mekong Delta region is now divided between Vietnam and Cambodia, and most of the ancient sites are buried under centuries of river silt or modern development. Let's take a gentle journey to the Mediterranean, to the island of Sardinia, to meet one of Europe's most mysterious ancient civilizations. The Nuragic civilization existed from roughly 1800 to 238 BCE, and they left behind over 7,000 stone structures called nuraj that are scattered across the island like ancient fortresses. The nuraj are remarkable structures, cone-shaped stone, towers built without mortar, some reaching heights of over 20 meters. They required sophisticated engineering and enormous amounts of labor to construct, suggesting a well-organized society with considerable resources. But here's what makes the Nuragic civilization perfect for our sleepy tour. We have no idea what most of these structures were actually for. The Nuragic people didn't leave written records, so we're left to guess based on archaeological evidence. What we do know is that the Nuragic civilization was remarkably long-lasting and sophisticated. They developed advanced metallurgy, producing bronze objects that were traded throughout the Mediterranean. They also created distinctive bronze figurines showing warriors, animals, and boats that provide glimpses into their culture and beliefs. The Nuragic people were skilled sailors who maintained trade, relationships with civilizations throughout the Mediterranean. Sardinian bronze objects have been found in Spain, France, Greece, and even Egypt, proving that this island civilization was connected to broader Mediterranean networks. They also developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, adapted to Sardinia's challenging environment. The island has limited water resources and poor soil in many areas. But the Nuragic people managed to support substantial populations for over 1,500 years. The civilization gradually declined as Sardinia was conquered by Carthaginians and later Romans. The Narration towers were abandoned, though many were reused by later peoples. The distinctive Nuragic culture was gradually absorbed into broader Mediterranean civilizations. But for 15 centuries, the Nuragic people maintained a unique civilization on Sardinia, building impressive monuments and participating in Mediterranean trade networks. They developed their own artistic traditions, religious practices, and social organization that lasted longer than most European kingdoms. Today, the Narration towers are scattered across Sardinia like ancient monuments to a forgotten people. Some have been restored and are popular tourist attractions, but most remain mysterious stone towers standing alone in fields and hills, remnants of a civilization that thrived for millennia before disappearing into history. Now, let's float over to the Persian Gulf to meet one of the ancient world's most important trading civilizations. Dilmun existed from roughly 3000 to 600 BCE, centered on what's now Bahrain, and they controlled much of the maritime trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Dilmun appears in some of the world's earliest literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it's described as a paradise where the immortals lived. This was probably just good marketing. The reality was that Dilmun was a successful trading civilization that got wealthy by facilitating commerce between other peoples. The Dilmun merchants were master pearl divers and traders, exporting pearls, copper, and precious stones throughout the ancient Middle East. They were probably the world's first specialist maritime traders, developing sailing technologies and commercial practices that would influence trade for millennia. Archaeological evidence shows that Dilmun cities had sophisticated urban planning, with residential districts, commercial areas, and elaborate burial grounds. The royal tombs contained goods from throughout the ancient world: carnelian from India, silver from Anatolia, gold from unknown sources. But here's what makes Dilmun perfect for our theme. They were successful through specialization rather than conquest. They didn't try to build a vast territorial empire. They focused on what they did best: maritime trade, pearl diving, and facilitating commerce between larger civilizations. Dilmun also appears to have been remarkably peaceful. There's little archaeological evidence of warfare or military fortifications. They seem to have maintained their independence through economic usefulness rather than military strength. The civilization gradually declined as trade patterns shifted and larger empires, first Assyrian, then Persian, gained control of Gulf trade routes. Dilmun wasn't conquered so much as it became economically irrelevant as new trade networks bypassed their traditional centers. By 600 BCE, Dilmun had largely disappeared as an independent political entity, though the region continued to be important for pearl diving until the modern oil era. The ancient cities were gradually abandoned or absorbed into larger political units. For over 2 millennia, Dilmun was one of the ancient world's most important commercial centers. They facilitated trade between some of history's earliest civilizations and developed maritime technologies that influenced the entire Indian Ocean region today. Dilmun is known mainly to specialists in ancient Middle Eastern history. Modern Bahrain has built a national identity partly around its Dilmun heritage. But most people have never heard of this ancient trading civilization that helped connect the earliest urban civilizations. Asterisk, let's drift over to South India now, to meet one of history's most successful maritime empires. The Chola Empire existed from roughly 300 BCE to 1279 CE, with its peak around the 10th and 11th centuries, when it controlled much of South India and projected naval power across the Indian Ocean. The Cholas are sometimes called the Forgotten Empire of Indian history, despite being one of the most powerful and long-lasting dynasties in Indian history. At their peak, under rulers like Rajaraja Chola I and his son Rajanadra Chola I, they controlled territories from Sri Lanka to parts of Southeast Asia. What makes the Cholas particularly remarkable is their naval power. They built one of the ancient world's most sophisticated naval forces, with ships capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers and supplies for extended campaigns. The Chola Navy controlled the Bay of Bengal and launched successful expeditions as far as Southeast Asia. The most famous Chola naval expedition was Rajendra Chola's conquest of parts of Southeast Asia around 1025 CE. The Chola fleet sailed to modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia, defeating the Srivijaya Empire and establishing Chola influence over important trade routes. But here's what makes the Cholas perfect for our sleepy tourist. Despite their military successes, they were primarily interested in trade and commerce. Their conquests were usually motivated by economic rather than territorial goals. They wanted to control trade routes, not necessarily govern distant territories. The Cholas were also remarkable builders and patrons of the arts. They constructed some of India's most impressive temples, including the Brihadiswar Temple at Thanjavur, which is still one of the tallest temple towers in the world. The temple was built without mortar and has survived multiple earthquakes over nearly 1,000 years. Chola bronze sculptures are considered among the finest examples of Indian art. Their famous bronze Natarashushava as the cosmic dancer has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Indian culture, though most people don't know it was created during the Chola period. The Cholas also developed sophisticated administrative systems that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Their inscriptions, carved in stone throughout South India, provide detailed records of their governmental, religious, and commercial activities. The empire's decline was gradual, facing pressure from the Pandyas in the south, the Hoysalas in the west, and eventually the Delhi Sultanate from the north. The last Chola king was defeated in 1279, ending one of the longest-lasting dynasties in Indian history for nearly 1,600 years. The Cholas were major players in Indian Ocean politics and commerce. They built impressive monuments, created remarkable art, and established trade networks that connected India with Southeast Asia and beyond. Today, the Chola Empire is largely forgotten outside of South India and academic circles. Their temples are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Their bronzes are in museums worldwide, but their name rarely appears in general histories of India or Asia. And here we are, at the end of another gentle journey through history's overlooked corners. We've visited desert engineers in Peru, ironworking pioneers in Nigeria, cloud warriors in the Andes, and maritime traders across 3 continents. We've seen civilizations that lasted for millennia, controlled vast territories, and influenced cultures across continents, all while somehow managing to slip through the cracks of popular memory. What strikes me about these forgotten civilizations is how remarkably competent they all were. The Mocha figured out how to thrive in one of the world's most challenging deserts. The Nabateans built sustainable cities in the Arabian Peninsula. The Cholas projected naval power across the Indian Ocean. These weren't dramatic flashing empires, they were the steady, reliable civilizations that made the ancient world work. Most of them succeeded through what we might call boring, virtues good engineering, practical diplomacy, sustainable resource management, and the patient work of building trade networks. They weren't trying to conquer the world or leave monuments to their own glory. They were just trying to solve the practical problems of human civilization, and they were remarkably good at it. The Nuragic people built 7,000 stone towers across Sardinia and maintained their civilization for 1,500 years. The Kanem Empire lasted for 7 centuries by mastering the logistics of trans-Saharan trade. The Dilmun merchants facilitated commerce between the world's earliest civilizations for over 2 millennia. These are extraordinary achievements, but they're the kind of achievements that don't make for exciting movies or dramatic documentaries. There are no heroic last stands, no tragic love stories, no apocalyptic endings, just people doing their jobs well, generation after generation, for hundreds or thousands of years. Maybe that's why they've been forgotten, while more dramatic civilizations are remembered. We remember Rome for its conquests and gladiators, but we forget the Cholas, who built a more sophisticated naval empire. We remember the Aztecs for their human sacrifice and dramatic conquest by courts, but we forget the Olmecs, who invented many of the cultural foundations of Mesoamerica. There's something deeply comforting about these forgotten success stories. In our age of global crises and dramatic politics, it's reassuring to know that most of human history has been people quietly figuring out how to make civilization work, building irrigation systems, facilitating trade, developing sustainable agricultural practices, creating art and literature, and solving the daily problems of human existence. The cloud warriors of the Chachapoya maintained their mountain civilization for 5 centuries in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Noack people developed iron-working technologies that transformed African agriculture. The Funan merchants connected the trade networks that linked China and India. These civilizations remind us that success doesn't require drama, that the most important work of civilization feeding people, creating beauty, facilitating cooperation between different groups, developing technologies that make life better, happens quietly, without fanfare, through the accumulated efforts of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. As we settle in for sleep, we can take comfort in these quiet success stories. They show us that building a good society doesn't require heroes or grand gestures or world-changing events. It just requires competent people doing careful work year after year, generation after generation. The gentle fall of empires teaches us that there are worse fates than being forgotten. These civilizations didn't fail, they succeeded so thoroughly that they created the conditions for new civilizations to flourish. They solved their problems, adapted to their environments, and left the world a little better than they found it. Sweet dreams, and remember, most of history is people like us, quietly making things work, building something beautiful and lasting, even if the world eventually forgets our names. The forgotten empires we visited tonight are proof that ordinary competence, sustained over time, is one of humanity's greatest and most underappreciated achievements. Good night.